So if you're keeping an eye on the news in Russia, there's some crazy stuff taking place there. There are drones swarming in Moscow. They're having to use air defenses to shoot down drones over Moscow. There are rebel raids that are crossing the border into Russian towns and taking those towns, and then the Russians have to retake them. There's mysterious fires all over Russia, explosions at oil storage depots, trains derailing left and right. It's pretty much a circus in Russia right now with regard to anything trying to affect the war in Ukraine. I'm not worried about the Russian response. I really don't care about the Russian response. What I am concerned about is the response coming out of the White House. Because when the Biden administration, whether it's Biden himself or other members of his administration, are asked about events taking place in Russia, specifically recently these drones over Moscow, the White House response is really weak. And they say things like, as a general matter, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. Seriously? That's the best you've got? Now look, I'm going to give credit to the Biden administration. This administration has done many things right. They blew the whistle on Russia's invasion plans and got a coalition to support Ukraine. And they eventually gave Ukraine some outstanding weapons, but it took them a long time. And it still takes a long time. And they waffle around about these weapons. And they don't want to give Ukraine the effective weapons that could potentially end this fight. It's infuriating. Now, I was on the F-16s will not help bandwagon. I made 2 videos on why, and I stand by that. And I still believe that they won't change the battlefield as much as we had hoped compared to other weapons. I believe F-16s play into Russian air defense strengths rather than give Ukraine a leg up. What I want to give them are ATACMS, for instance, or even longer range missiles, because I'm completely down with Ukraine having the ability to hit any Russian base in Russia. Russia's not special. When you start a war, that war can come to your front doorstep. That's just the way it is. But the White House and the Department of Defense keep shooting themselves in the foot with really silly rhetoric. They leak stuff to friendly journalists. They talk about their fears of Russian escalation, they hopes for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that aren't going to happen. And then even worse, they sometimes undermine or doubt Ukraine's abilities to prosecute the war. And these things play right into the hands of the Russians. And then they drop really dumb comments like, again, as a general matter, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. This type of stuff creates division between us and the Ukrainians. It makes the European politicians nervous. It gives Russian propagandists a buffet of material to use for their own people to show that our support is waning. Now, I'm going to talk about this comment because it's just pretty clueless when you look at the history of how all warfare has taken place. What country has ever won a war just by hunkering down and defending their own turf? Ukraine was brutally attacked in their country. They have every right to fight back in Russia. Remember when the US got hit by Japan on December 7th, 1941? Probably not, because most of you weren't alive then. But those of you that were, thanks for following me, and that's awesome. But what did we do? Did we just twiddle our thumbs and search for aircraft carriers to make sure it didn't happen again? Hell no. We took the fight right to Japan. And even into Japan. And here's the strategic kicker to this. The raids that we are saying we don't support, the drones we don't support in Russia, actually mess with the Russians' planning a lot. It demoralizes their public. It distracts Russian resources and takes the focus off the main front lines. The more Russian troops that have to guard the border, the fewer they can station elsewhere. The more they have to invest in missile defenses in places like Belgorod or Russian towns, the less missile defense support they have in their fight on the front lines. Not only that, these types of attacks play mind games with the people of Russia, especially in Moscow, where the potential uprisings of anti-war sentiment can start. This weakens Russian defenses and messes with the Kremlin's heads, and they're now having to deal with the public opinion as well as the actual fight and the global opinion. So with these White House statements we have this air of anxiety that comes out, and it's American naivety that I see in this. We've only had 2 major attacks on our soil in the past century and a half. Once in 1941, as I talked about, the other was 2001. We can't fathom what it's like to have missiles raining down on our cities or deal with the horrors of an invading army. If anything remotely close to what is happening in Ukraine happened to the US, we would not hold back. We would unleash hell, no questions asked. I mean, after 9/11, we spent 10 years looking for Osama bin Laden, killed him in Pakistan, then dumped his ass in the ocean. Look at what happened to Japan. We messed them up so badly, they became the politest nation in the world. And we're going to sit here and tell Ukraine that we don't support strikes into Russia? I don't buy it. The White House needs a reality check. They need to remember that we've had our fair share of politically motivated warfare failures. Vietnam, Afghanistan, those did not end well for us. And it was the politics behind them, not necessarily the militaries. The administration needs to get the politics out of the way. They need to stop belittling smaller countries like Ukraine and Poland and Baltic nations. These are countries fighting in the trenches that border Russia, both figuratively and literally. They literally deal with the threats. They have real world experience. Many of them were a part of the Russian apparatus during the Soviet era, so they understand it. War is messy and it's brutal, and it requires a deep understanding of the visceral realities, not just some textbook knowledge that you can call upon on page 25 of Diplomacy 101's textbook. I did not use anything I learned in any of my college experiences when I was in Iraq. Nothing. So here is my message to the White House and all of these officials that are kind of wringing their hands. Stop being so damn condescending. Stop underestimating the will and capabilities of a country like Ukraine. They've been through hell and they are fighting tooth and nail for their survival, as well as the Western-led order of democracy, an order that the U.S. traditionally is the forefront of. We are the leader of this order. The Ukrainians and the Poles and all the Baltics deserve our respect and support, not our patronizing assessments. They deserve our confidence, not clutching at pearls over Russian aggression and Russian escalation. I mean, we need to learn from history. We've made mistakes in the past, and some of them got us to where we are today. The mistakes that we allowed Russia to run rampant in Syria, the mistakes in 2014 where we allowed Ukraine to be invaded in the first place, those failures of the West and the United States to react laid the groundwork for the current situation we are in. We need to chart a better path forward. And sometimes you have to watch your words in the political arena, but there's something to be said about keeping your mouth shut when you don't have anything useful to say. Winston Churchill, who is a huge hero of mine, was one of the guys that did it best. He used no comment all the time. And maybe it's time for White House officials to just say nothing. If you can't say something that is going to either be positive for Ukraine, or at the very least, if it's going to be neutral, that's fine. But if you have to say something where Russia looks better, just don't say anything at all. We're trying to not have them win here. We have picked a side. Let's own that side. In the end, we need to be smart, and we need to have a nuanced approach to what Russia and Ukraine are doing. We can't allow the idea of what Americans would be doing guide our actions. We must stand with Ukraine and let Ukraine do what's best for Ukraine, and understand that the best outcome for the United States is a Ukraine victory. And we need to provide that support to them and let them defend themselves against Russian aggression. And we need to just ditch these weak statements and start backing up our words with actions. So for the White House, we need to, again, just learn from history, support Ukraine, and show up. We are the U.S. We need to live up to the U.S. that the world believes we are. The United States that helped the Allies smoke not only Germany, but also Japan in the same war. And that we can be a force for good. And it starts with essentially pulling our head out of our ass and making more of the right moves without worrying about the Russian reaction.